This video is going to be about the myth of Prometheus. And actually this is the second version I record, because the first one was one of my first videos and I found the audio quality very bad, so I decided to remake the video, and hopefully you enjoy this version. So we're going to talk about the story of Prometheus itself, what mythology tells us about his character. But as always in our videos about mythology, the interesting thing is to try to understand what a myth tells us, where its appeal comes from, and how a myth can cross generations, centuries, until it reaches us today. So what Greek mythology tells us about Prometheus is that he was a titan, and for the ancient Greeks, the titans were the first gods, the first divinities that had appeared. But these titans lost their predominance to the gods of Olympus, and the king of these gods, Zeus, after a very fierce war between the two groups of divinities. Now what the myth of Prometheus says is that when all the creatures that would live on the earth in our world were created, they all received particular capabilities, weapons to fight and survive on this world. Animals had fur to keep them warm. They had claws or teeth to hunt and to feed themselves. But among all these new beings that populated the world, one particular species, the man, received nothing. They were naked. They got no particular ability to defend themselves, and this seemed to doom the man to extinction. But Prometheus, in order to compensate for this, decided to steal the secret of fire from the gods and offer it as a gift to humanity in order to ensure its survival and even make it the dominant species in the world. For this theft and for having taken one of the gods' secrets and given it to the man, Prometheus was sentenced, was punished by the gods, and precisely he was sentenced to be chained to a mountain forever, and every day an eagle, the eagle was the symbol of Zeus, the king of gods, would fly to him and feed on its liver. But because Prometheus was a titan, he was immortal, and as he couldn't die, this punishment would start all over again every day until the end of times. So what does this myth tell us? The first thing to understand is that fire in this story is like a metaphor of technical knowledge, because controlling fire makes it possible to invent new things, to develop knowledge always further, and take a decisive advantage against any other creature in the world. And this tells us a lot about how the Greeks perceived themselves and how, as their heirs, philosophically, intellectually, we tend to see ourselves in the world. The men do not question anymore their position in the creation or in the world as the dominant species. And this myth, from a Greek perspective, justifies this position, contrary to all other species, all other creatures in the world. The man received a very particular knowledge, a very particular capacity, which allows them to progress on their own, to make new discoveries. And this capacity is of divine origin. It was stolen from the gods, which gives humanity a very particular status, and one that is above the other species that populate our world. We may find this obvious today, but actually this is because we inherited this vision from the Greeks, this way of making a theory that justifies the superiority of man against the rest of beings that live in our world. If you look at primitive societies and even earlier civilizations, there was not such a conception of the central place of man among all the beings that live in our world. But there is also more to this myth, and in particular it contains warnings to the man. The first warning, which is quite obvious if you read the story literally in the first degree, is the risk of punishment if you don't respect the will of God, if you cross the limits. As I said in various videos about myth, these stories may have a social dimension, a social role to teach people the limits that they should not cross in order to make life in society possible. And in particular, for the Greeks, that was a constant worry that people could override the rules and put the entire society in danger because of their behavior. In particular, the Greeks had a term called hubris to name this excessive ambition, this lack of respect for the limits of our condition that could make someone override the limits. And when the hubris was unleashed, this could lead to disastrous consequences. So it was important to check that no one would dramatically get out of his status, of its place in the society, in order to avoid complete disasters. And as we see in the story of Prometheus, once the limits have been crossed, once the punishment has happened, it is no longer possible to go back, and the consequences are eternal. They cannot be undone. But there is also another dimension to the warning enclosed in this story of Prometheus, and this is one about the consequences of technical progress too, because the Greeks had understood that technical knowledge, technical progress represented by fire here that the man had received, and that made them a different species than other creatures, also had its dangers, its terrible implications. They understood it with the development of weapons that were much more efficient and deadly than the weapons of nature. And this dimension of the myth speaks to us very much today, maybe even more than the Greeks, because we know that on the one hand, technical progress, which has continued and accelerated after the ancient Greek civilization disappeared, can bring plenty of good things, can improve our lives, and constantly reinforce our control over nature. But on the other hand, we also realize that this technical level that we have reached can also be a threat to our survival. It could lead to the eradication of man, given the weapons we have created. We also realize that the world we live in may be threatened by our actions through the exhaustion of natural resources or the destruction of the environment, and this condemns us to make always more technical progress to compensate the consequences of the destruction we also generate. And this concern has been reinforced in particular when the Industrial Revolution began. And not surprisingly, one of the modern incarnations of this myth of Prometheus is the novel Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. Actually, the novel is subtitled Frankenstein, or the myth of the modern Prometheus. I suppose you know the original story. Frankenstein was a scientist, and he gave life to a creature made with body parts. But the creature gets out of control and ultimately kills its creator. And the metaphor here strongly reminds of this myth of Prometheus. Due to a lack of wisdom, for having ignored the limits and gone too far into scientific exploration with a lack of conscience, the scientist has been punished, and the consequences are irreversible. So ultimately, this myth of Prometheus is also for the men an invitation to find within themselves the necessary conscience, the wisdom, the moderation that will make it possible for them to survive, to tame their will of power, and control their taste for testing the limits always further. That's it for today, and as always I hope you enjoyed this moment. So I'll see you soon for another video. Bye bye.